former transport minister and a man who took part in the protests himself. But hundreds of demonstrators continue to gather in Tahrir Square to keep up the pressure for change. They include removing the 30-year-old emergency law that allows people to be arrested and held without charge. They want the dissolution of the State Security Investigation Bureau and the immediate release of all political prisoners. Those all remain high on the agenda for protesters. So what other issues lie ahead? Well, let's take a quick look. As we've just mentioned, the people want the removal of anyone who was pro-Mubarak or appointed by him. But could there be a power vacuum in their place? Egypt's ruling generals have provisionally decided to hold a constitutional referendum on March 19th. Parliamentary elections are set for June and a presidential poll in August. But youth activists criticise the tight timetable, saying it would favour remnants of the National Democratic Party. And finally, although the Military Council has received an amended version of the Constitution, they have yet to publicly approve it, leaving the people unsure of what lies ahead. Well, joining us now to talk more about this from Cairo, Hossam El-Hamalawi, activist who has closely worked with labour unions and work strikers in Egypt. Hossam, many thanks for being with us. I want to start with the announcement of the resignation of the Prime Minister, Ahmed Shafiq. What do you make of that? Is that a promising start?
Well, I'm definitely happy for this move, and I am sure that many of our comrades and colleagues are also jubilant about what happened today. And this also happens as other cheerful news is coming out. The Cairo University administration has announced that it's also lifting the notorious police security forces they had on campus, and they will replace it with a civilian security force. And we have some of the prominent political activists, like some of the leaders of the Muslim Brotherhood, who've been sentenced in military tribunals on bogus charges. They will also be released. But I have to say this is not enough. What's more important is the significance of that move other than the move itself. This means that we have pressured the military junta into making another concession, but the pressure should not stop.
And what do you think of his replacement, Issam Sharaf? Is he up to the job?
I don't know Mr. Issam Sharaf personally, but from what we hear about him is that he looks as definitely someone who's much more respectable than the other regime figures that have been presented to us before. But here is my concern. The current civilian government in the making and the current reforms are happening while the military generals who are part of Mubarak's regime are supervising the process. So that's why we're always concerned what sort of regime will come out after this process. So we have to be vigilant and we have to continue with our protests and our strikes, especially that there are some alarming signs. Today, the military police suspended by force a strike by the gas and oil workers in Nasr City who were protesting in front of the oil ministry, and they arrested 20 and they injured 3. This is happening as also other protesters like our friend Amr Abdullah al-Bahiri have been sentenced on bogus charges in a military tribunal a couple of days ago to 5 years in prison. So as you can see, there are conflicting signs that we are receiving, so we have to continue to be vigilant.
What let's talk a bit more specifics about the civilian government that you mentioned earlier. What other posts do you want to see people replaced?
Well, definitely all the posts. Not a single post would be an exception. This is a revolution. A revolution is about, at the end of the day, establishing a new regime. A new regime means new institutions and new structures. We have a saying here in Egypt, ما ينفعش تعمل من الفسيخ شربات. You cannot make a sweet drink out of rotten fish. And the Mubarak's dictatorship has been a rotten fish. So all officials coming from that dictatorship will be rotten fish, as well as the institutions. It's not just about individuals. For example, how can you reform State Security Police and our Interior Ministry? This is an institution that has been solely devoted not to the protection of the public security of the Egyptian citizens, but of the political security of the state. Now, to think that if we get a new general to lead that institution, speaking of which, there was a very worrying report today in Al-Ahram mentioning that General Nabil Al-Izabi is recommended for that post. We cannot confirm that, but General Nabil Al-Izabi is the butcher of Kifaya, as we call him. He's the guy who oversaw the crackdown on the Cairo Spring in 2006, and he's the guy who orchestrated the sexual assaults against women reporters and activists on the 25th of May 2005 in what became to be known as Black Wednesday. So that's why, although it's definitely an optimistic sign that Shafiq was impeached or he resigned, and that we have a much more respectable figure now, but we have to continue to be vigilant.
And how do you propose to continue to push those in power to enact the reforms that you're talking about? Is it continued protests out in the streets?
Okay, well, the mainstream media and the government has tended to deal with the Egyptian revolution as a Tahrir revolution solely, meaning that everything more or less in the public media and in policy making has been solely devoted more or less to what's going on in Tahrir and the mood in Tahrir and the protests in Tahrir. But I want to draw your attention to another phenomena which is taking place and hasn't received its share of media coverage, which is the labor strikes. And that's the only weapon we have now. It was the mass strikes 2 days before Mubarak resigned or Mubarak stepped down. These are the mass strikes that brought down Hosni Mubarak. And with the stepping down of Hosni Mubarak on the 11th of February, on a Friday, these strikes basically did not stop. While the middle-class activists were too happy to call on everybody to go back to work and to build a new Egypt, and let's give it 110% and be loyal and be faithful, you know, and they were singing all of these patriotic lullabies. Now, I'm afraid that the working class cannot afford doing the same, because a middle class, let's say a middle class person who works in a job, probably he's getting something like that's more than 1,000 Egyptian pounds and can go up to 7,000 Egyptian pounds. But if you look at the public transport workers here in Cairo who've been staging continuous strikes and demonstrations, you can meet a worker or a driver who's been in service for 20 years and he still receives 189 Egyptian pounds. I cannot ask this worker to go back and to resume his work under these conditions. And these workers are not going to wait for another 6 months when the military junta would be kind enough to allow us a civilian government in order to get his economic rights. So if you ask me about what's the next step is throwing ourselves 120% in this current strike wave, unionizing workers, bringing together strike leaders in a national network, meaning establishing a new trade union federation, and last but not least, establishing a workers' party that will represent the political interests of the working class and the majority of the urban poor in Egypt in the current revolution.
All right, let me put forward to you the view that I know many Egyptians have, is that while they sympathize and they share